This is Grandmaster Daniel Naroditsky. We are watching Grandmaster Kirill Alekseenko take on the world champion at the 2021 FIDE World Rapid and Blitz. Alekseenko with the white pieces, Magnus playing e4, e5, and we have an Italian. Magnus responding with the symmetrical bishop c5, a castle from Alekseenko. The main move there is c3. Let's see if he reverts back to the main line. He does with d3. Magnus responding with d6. This is a traditional Italian. There's the typical c3 move, and a7, a5 by the world champion. Normally black plays a6 in that position, and that immediately gets Alekseenko thinking. He mumbles something to himself. Knight b to d2 right there as he adjusts a piece. That's pretty typical. Now the idea of a5 as opposed to a6 is to grab more space on the queen side, and that a pawn can advance further to a4. Magnus castles h2, h3 by Alekseenko, so still making all of the sort of typical Italian moves. Now, will Magnus play bishop e6? No, he drops his other bishop back to a7 so that d4 or knight b3 doesn't come with tempo. Now, generally, white plays rook e1 in these positions, and then perhaps knight d2 to f1 to g3. But how will Alekseenko structure his pieces now that Magnus's pawn is on a5? Will that impact how he positions his pieces? No, rook f1 to e1, typical bishop c8 to e6, and now a big decision to make for Kirill. Does he take that bishop and follow up with something like queen b3? The drawback of that is that that opens the f-file for the black rook, and the pressure on white's f2 pawn can grow pretty severe. But leaving the tension could allow black to take on c4 under favorable circumstances. So Alekseenko moves the bishop away to b5. What an interesting move, and that's a direct way to exploit Magnus playing a5 rather than a6 as the world champion brings his own knight from e7 to g6. Alekseenko grabbing the center with d4, now completing his own knight maneuver with knight f1. Very tense position. Magnus could play c6 here in order to chase away the white bishop from b5 so that he could then play rook e8. You can't play rook e8 right now. You can't play rook e8 right now. You can't play c6. Let's see what the world champion does here. Magnus continues to think. Wow, it's taking him a while here to decide what to play. Maybe he doesn't want to play c6 because that weakens the d6 pawn. You cannot put anything on the a4, e8 diagonal. He finally plays c6. Maybe he really didn't want to weaken that d6 pawn. Bishop drops back to d3. Alekseenko playing fast and confidently. Does look like white is slightly better here. Let's see, Magnus contemplating his next move. He plays a4. What an interesting move. So now if queen takes a4, he wants to take the d4 pawn with his bishop. That pawn is essentially untouchable. Alekseenko would have to give away his d4 pawn. He doesn't want to do that. He continues his maneuver. b5 by Magnus, grabbing more space on the queen side. It still feels like Kirill has a very comfortable position, though. A nice center, well defended by the bishops. Let's see, bishop out to e3. He's got a significant time advantage. And how will Magnus continue putting pressure on the queen side and making sure that he's not overextending himself? Queen d8 to c7, opening up space for the rooks to come, perhaps to d8, maybe to e8. Alekseenko responds in kind with queen c2, paving the way for rook a d1. But one thing that Alekseenko has to watch for, he can't really move his a1 rook out of the way because he's going to blunder the a2 pawn, and that bishop on a2 is not going to be trapped. It's going to have an evacuation square on b3. So Alekseenko playing b3 himself, restricting the flow of black's light-squared bishop, and perhaps preparing to get his a-rook to d1. Magnus responding with a waiting move, h7, h6, making Luft. And will Alekseenko put a knight on f5? How aggressively does he play here? The position tremendously complex here. Lots of tension on all sides of the board. Rook a d1 looks pretty natural to me, but perhaps Alekseenko doesn't want to give away control of the a-file after a takes b3. No, he does end up... Oh, he plays rook a c1. Interesting move there. Perhaps he's preparing for the eventuality that Magnus takes on d4. In that case, white will recapture with a pawn and have big-time pressure on black's c6 pawn. Kirill could also be preparing the move c3, c4 himself, and Magnus moves his queen away from the x-ray of the rook, and Magnus takes more control of the a-file, preparing a takes b3 as Alekseenko closes down the a-file, b4, and a3 by Magnus, fixing the pawn on a2 on a weak square where it is targeted by that light-squared bishop. Oh man, things getting more and more complex, and finally a trade, d takes c5, Alekseenko trading pawns on the center, Magnus responding, and c3, c4. Here we go, Alekseenko following up on his plan that he started with rook c1, a trade of bishops. Now Magnus could sink his teeth into f4, but the e5 pawn could get loose. Will we have another trade on c4? Now, the thing about that a3 pawn over there in the corner is that it could get quite weak in an endgame. Right now, it's not targeted by the white pieces, but that rook from e3 could be eyeing that pawn hungrily if Magnus trades on c4. Now, rook a b8, rook fc8. Lots of ways that Magnus could keep the tension here. He hesitated, almost touching his queen there. Maybe he wants to play queen b6. No, now he plays rook f8 to c8. He doesn't seem too satisfied in his position. Maybe Magnus is a little bit worried about that a3 pawn and its safety. Now, Alekseenko can drop his bishop back from d3 in order to extend the connection between that rook and the pawn. He finally settles into perhaps his first longer think of the game. Kirill has played exceptionally fast thus far. Magnus could also be thinking about c5 himself in order to create complete pandemonium on the queen side and try to exploit the awkward positioning of white's queen on c2, which is right now x-rayed by that rook on c8. What will Alekseenko do? He plays c5. What a committal decision. He closes down the queen side and now moves his bishop back. Magnus must be a little relieved at that as he quickly plays queen a4, offering a queen trade. It's declined by Kirill. Queen c3, definitely getting Magnus puzzled there. And the a2 pawn can be captured, but then white has rook a1, and white recaptures on a3 and gains control of the a file. But Magnus, he goes rook d1. Rook takes d1. Trade of rooks. Rook dropping back to e1. Queen moving back to a4. A trade of rooks. Who does that favor? Well, on the one hand, it would favor black because now white has to delegate a lot of effort to defending that a2 pawn, which is currently under attack. Kirill has to defend it. Will he defend it with a rook or the queen? He moves his queen back to d2, simultaneously getting control of the d file. Pace of play is accelerating. Rook a7, great move by the world champion, preparing rook d7, forcing Kirill to move his rook into the corner. Rook a1, but now the queen moves back to c3. And the e5 pawn, Magnus still cannot fall asleep in regards to that pawn, although currently if it's captured, Magnus will recapture and then take on b4. Kirill, I think he touched a piece there as he shakes his head. He doesn't like what he's seeing here. Continues to shake his head. He's exasperated. Magnus has grabbed control of the d-file. Magnus has made a lot of progress here, and Kirill has now his back to the wall. Bishop d3 and bishop c2 might be one way to try to solve some of the problems as he moves his knight back to e2, and he touched the knight. That was not deliberate, but he had to move it, and he gives up e4. Magnus is making moves here. Knight f6, knight g3. Now Kirill is down a pawn, but it's not so easy to win this. He still has the b4 and a2 pawns defended. He's got all the penetration squares covered. Magnus a little bit frustrated there. Knight f6 to d5, attacking b4, and Kirill defends it with his rook. Now bishop f5 is not possible. Magnus has to defend e5, and Kirill pushing the h-pawn, trying to create counterplay against the black king. Knight gf4. Magnus continues to make progress. Queen e4 checking g8. Now don't miss knight c3. Knight c3 is a huge fork threat. Kirill has to move either his rook or his queen in order to defend against that. He moves his rook, but now he gives up another pawn. Queen takes b4. Things are collapsing for Alekseenko. Can he pull a miracle out of a hat? I don't see one. He moves his queen back. He has to keep queens on the board. Queen b2, another great move by Magnus. But what if white takes it and plays rook b1? Does not that win the b2 pawn? Maybe that is Kirill's best chance here, and he does trade queens. And that is not a good prospect to be 2 pawns down against the world champion, but he takes one of them, and Magnus sliding his rook into d1, and a2 is also hanging. Magnus could take that pawn. Bishop takes a2, or knight takes a2. He takes it with the bishop. Now that knight is defending the bishop. Can the knight be attacked with rook c2? Then Magnus would play b4. Knight back to d2. Magnus moving his bishop back to d5. f3. Kirill trying to do what he can. He's 2 pawns down. He has his back to the wall. Rook c1. Knight f5. Alekseenko trying to get active with his knight. Knight a4 attacking the rook. Moving it away to b4. And another pawn falls. Rook takes c5. My goodness. Magnus is taking everything. Knight b3. He's 3 complete full pawns up. This should be a pretty straightforward win by the world champion, but we've seen crazier things happen in Blitz. Rook d3, Alekseenko trying to get active. Magnus continues eliminating counterplay with h5. g6 kicking the knight away. Kirill, though, sinking into d6. Magnus hesitating there. Knight e4 could be a little annoying. He moves his knight back to b6, knight back to e4, but the rook has plenty of room. Rook c1, and now Magnus is ready to push the b pawn. No, not yet. He moves his king up first. Rook a2, knight a4, shutting down the a file. Magnus is merciless. He eliminates all of the counterplay. Knight a c3, moving his horsey in, preparing to trade it for white's knight. Kirill says no, no, no. Alekseenko has to keep his knight alive. Knight b1 check, what a move. Knight e6, king f7, and now a trade. But what does Magnus take? If Magnus takes the bishop, he loses the pawn on c6. If he takes the knight, he loses the pawn on g6. That was a mistake by Carlsen. And the world champion decides to give up the g6 pawn, but now he shouldn't give up h5. Knight f4 here, defends h5, but Alekseenko can play bishop e8, attacking c6. Oh no, that doesn't attack c6. The rook on c1 defends it. He's going to have to move his bishop to d7. Magnus finally pushes his pawn. Bishop f5, knight d5, shutting down the d file, g4, but Aleksenko's creating a passed pawn. This is not over. Knight e3, attacking the bishop, and now the rook moves in. The rook is sliding in. The bishop is keeping itself alive, and white is now going to have a passed pawn. Can Alekseenko push it? No, he takes g4. He's now ready to push his h-pawn. Magnus has let this get really complicated. Rook b7, stopping the pawn. Rook c2, and Magnus's pawn is on b2. And how do you push it past b2? How do you push that pawn past b2? King moving back to h2. Okay. What does Magnus do here? He's repeating moves. He's hesitating. He has no time. King g3. He's repeating. King h2. And Aleksenko is ready to push his h-pawn down to h6. And it's going to be unstoppable. And Magnus has to settle for a draw. And you can see the exasperation. What a save by Kirill Alekseenko. Wow. If you want more videos like this, make sure to click the link in the playlist. Thank you for watching.